She only wanted to hear her grandson's voice. One quiet call, I just wanted to check in. But instead came 5 careless words. Stop calling me. You're annoying. Click. Silence. What happens when love meets a wall of indifference? Alone in a small kitchen, Miriam doesn't fight back or plead. She writes. She bakes. She gives what she can to strangers who begin, slowly, to give back. Letters slip under her door. Kindness returns in unexpected hands. And a life once centered on waiting finds its way toward living. Late morning. The kitchen light is thin, the kind that slips in quiet and doesn't bother to fill corners. The house is still. A single clock ticks with a click just sharp enough to measure seconds, but not loud enough to hurry them. On the small table by the window sits a landline phone, plastic beige, cord long enough to tangle. Its receiver resting in a cradle, polished smooth where hands have set it down countless times. She reaches for it. With the same careful economy she gives to everything. Turning first the page of the ledger beside her sugar jar, marking the day's date in neat blue ink. A call she has decided to say nothing urgent, just to ask if he's eaten, if he's well, if the rain reached his side of town. The phone is warm against her palm from the slow heat of the house. She dials numbers from memory, each click soft and patient. At the other end, a hum begins, rings stacking on top of one another. Then the breath of someone young, quick, a little ragged, already impatient. Hello. It isn't question so much as sigh. She smiles into the receiver. It's just me, sweetheart. A pause heavy enough to feel. Then his voice again, sharper. Stop calling me, you're annoying. No shout, no curse, only those 5 words. Said with the careless confidence of youth, of someone who doesn't think sound travels far or carries weight. Then the soft, deliberate click of the line going dead. A silence so immediate it hums. She holds the receiver there for a second longer. Not shocked, not defensive, but letting the absence settle. Then she lowers it slowly, both hands engaged, aligning the curled cord so it lies flat instead of twisted. The cradle clicks back into place with the smallest sigh. She sits still, the phone returned, her hand resting on the table's edge. For a moment she watches the room. The kettle on the stove still warm from earlier tea. A single cup with a faint half-moon stain where lips touched. Dust drifting in the light. She breathes long and quiet and feels the house hold its breath with her. The ledger remains open. Its page, ruled in soft gray lines, shows yesterday's neat entries. Flower, post, call to doctor. She draws one line beneath them. On the blank space, she writes carefully. Calls ceased. The letters come slow but straight, ink flowing without blot. She does not underline in anger, only in finality. When the words are done, she lifts the pen, taps it once on the page to let the ink set, and caps it with the same small click she gave the phone. Her gaze drifts back to the receiver. She touches the base once with her fingertips, smoothing invisible dust. Not to erase anything, just to keep order. Then she stands. The chair legs scrape lightly against linoleum. A sound that would not wake anyone, but echoes enough in the quiet. She moves toward the window. The one that looks out to the street where morning is barely starting. A delivery truck turns the corner, tires hissing over wet pavement. Across the way, a neighbor leans from her porch to shake a doormat, dust floating like tiny birds. The ordinary world keeps moving, unaffected by 5 words and a click. She presses her palm once to the cool glass, not for comfort but for contact. The world is still there, as it always is. She exhales, the breath fogging a small circle before clearing. Then she returns to the table, flips the ledger closed with a gentle motion, and sets her teacup on its cover. It is not anger that fills the kitchen now, only space. A space made by sound leaving and silence taking its place. She stands inside it for a while, still enough to hear the clock tick and the house breathe, and then sits again, ready to decide what comes after a call that ends with stop. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood polish, a scent that had belonged to the house long before her hair turned white. Sunlight touched the counters unevenly, striking glass jars and making their contents glow. Sugar, flour, tea leaves folded in wax paper. In the center, on a square of oilcloth patterned with faded apples, lay her ledger. It was older than her grandson by decades, cloth-bound. Corners softened, spine cracked in places where time had bent it. She had once kept house accounts in it, groceries tallied in neat columns, electric bills noted with a simple paid. Later it became more than numbers, a record of weather. Who stopped by? What small kindnesses had passed through the door? She called it her book of days. Though no one else knew or cared to ask, she set it open again now. Though the last entry called cease stared back at her with fresh, unblinking ink. The words looked steady enough, but they tugged at her chest as though something had been cleanly cut. She traced the page lightly with her fingertip, following the faint ridges where pen had pressed through paper. Then she flipped backward, scanning older lines. July 17th, J. Came by for soup. August 3rd, rain all morning, baked bread. September's pages were crowded with errands and small victories. A hinge fixed, a birthday card mailed, a laugh shared with the woman upstairs. She paused at a line from last spring, called M, no answer, left a message. There had been so many of those. The house quiet after the dial tone, the answering machine's polite beep. Her voice too cheerful for the silence that followed. She turned the page forward and returned to the fresh ink. Coal ceased. A simple truth, nothing cruel about the way the pen had shaped it. Her hands moved with a muscle memory older than hurt. She uncapped the pen again, the same fine black one she'd used for years, and drew a small square beside the words. Not a check mark, not completion. Just a box space to fill later if life rewrote the line. Then she closed the book halfway, folding one cover over the other, leaving it still breathing. Ready for more? On the counter's edge sat her teacup from earlier. She poured the dregs into the sink, rinsed the cup, dried it with a linen towel embroidered decades ago. The routine steadied her hands. A person could keep living, she thought, if the small rituals stayed intact. Across the room the telephone rested in its cradle. Coiled cord obedient for once. She considered moving it into a drawer, perhaps, but decided against it. Phones have no malice. They only carry voices, both sharp and soft. She would let it stay. The refrigerator hummed, steady and familiar. She opened it just to busy herself, counting the small supplies, half a loaf. Butter wrapped in its wax paper, a cluster of apples in the crisper. Enough for today and tomorrow. She closed the door and smoothed the note she'd taped there months ago, back when she started writing small reminders. Some were recipes, some were fragments of thought. Today's was practical. Bread almost gone. Check stamps. Stamps, the word caught her attention, and she smiled faintly. Letters, after all, did not hang up mid-sentence. They waited. They let you speak slowly, even clumsily, and forgave you for needing paper to help you mean things, right? She slid open the top drawer where she kept envelopes and pens. Inside was a tidy chaos. Spare keys, a tiny screwdriver, rubber bands looped neatly, and a pack of note cards with pale blue borders. She took one out, held it against the counter, but didn't write yet. Not now. Not when the words still trembled. Instead, she set the blank card beside the ledger, aligning edges. She would decide later if it became a letter or stayed a silent placeholder. Either way, it would wait. For a while she stood in the still kitchen, listening to the tick of the wall clock and the distant rumble of a passing truck. Life beyond her windows went on unbothered. She touched the ledger once more, palm flat over the cover as if sealing something in but not locking it away. Then she exhaled, long and quiet, and let her hands rest on the cool counter. Nothing catastrophic had happened, she told herself. Just words. Just one sharp slice across an old connection. And yet she felt it the way air felt different after a door shut. She smoothed the oilcloth with her palm, resetting the quiet. Calls ceased. The line would stay, at least for now. But the ledger had other pages, other space. And she was not done living. Morning had not turned loud yet. The world outside her windows stayed measured and slow. After closing the ledger, she rinsed her hands under the cool tap, wiped them on the towel that hung from the oven door, and reached for her favorite teacup. It was small and white, its handle shaped like a question mark, rim chipped in one place but still smooth enough to drink from. Steam rose from the kettle with a low sigh, curling into the kitchen like breath from another room. She spooned loose leaves into a small strainer, the scent of dried chamomile and lemon peel blooming as hot water poured over them. She had learned to time tea by color, not clocks. Pale gold at first, then amber, deepening slowly. When it looked right, she set the strainer aside and pressed the spoon gently against its edge to save every drop. The cup in hand, she walked toward the living room, slippers whispering across worn linoleum, and then the softer hush of rug. Her quiet chair waited near the front window. It was older than her grandson, too. Upholstered decades ago in a muted floral pattern, now faded to near abstraction. The cushion had molded to her weight over years. A nest built of patience. She sat carefully, balancing the cup on the armrest while settling her body. The house adjusted around her, the clock still ticking, the refrigerator's hum steady, a faraway car passing outside. She sipped. The tea was hotter than expected. Small sting that brought her fully awake. It was here she often did her sorting, not of objects, but of thoughts. Today the first one arrived, sharp and bright, his voice on the line, sudden and cutting, telling her to stop. The words replayed cleanly. There was no static, no confusion. "Stop calling me, you're annoying." They sat now in her lap like a stone she hadn't chosen to carry. She tried not to decorate them with blame or excuse. The boy was busy, perhaps. Young men can be careless with tone. Still, something inside her had shifted when the line went dead. Not anger, she searched herself carefully. No, it wasn't anger. It was more like a slow unwinding, the way a cord slips free of a knot. Her eyes wandered to the window. Across the street, a sparrow hopped along the gutter, paused, and flicked its tail. A neighbor's curtains fluttered once and fell still. The world's small proofs that life did not halt just because a phone conversation ended badly. She wrapped both hands around the cup, feeling its warmth seep into her skin. In the past, she might have picked up the phone again, tried to smooth things while the air was still warm with words. But not now. The ledger said calls ceased, and she meant to respect her own handwriting. Sometimes silence is the only safe bridge. Her gaze traveled to the low table beside the chair. A stack of old note cards rested there too, the same pale blue she'd pulled earlier. She touched the top one, but didn't lift it. Letter writing could wait. The wound was too fresh, even if small. Better to let it cool before putting pen to paper. Steam from her cup misted the window pane slightly. She leaned forward and, with the sleeve of her sweater, rubbed a small circle clear so she could watch the street better. Down the block, a boy rode past on a bicycle, coat flapping, backpack loose. She smiled faintly, unbidden. Time had a way of cycling back, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle. The tea cooled enough to drink easily. She sipped again, slower now. Thought followed. She was not alone, not abandoned, only repositioned. A generation was busy making itself, and she belonged to another pace. It hurt a little to be left behind, but hurt was not the whole of living. On the wall hung a photograph of her own son, the boy's father, younger than the grandson now. His eyes in the picture were bright and serious. She remembered their own sharp words once upon a time, slammed doors, months without calls. And yet years had come, smoothed edges, taught apologies. She had learned to wait before. She could wait again. The teacup emptied slowly until only warmth remained at the bottom. She set it down with care on the small saucer, the porcelain whispering against wood. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled by, its diesel growl fading into distance. She breathed deep, the kind that travels to the bottom of the lungs and back. This was the first quiet after pain's a sorting hour. She called it silently. Not yet peace, but the space before it. Where everything rearranges. She reached for the ledger once more, though only to rest her palm on its closed cover from where she sat. Not to write. just to feel its steadiness. A book of days doesn't flinch because one of them hurts. When the tea was gone and the quiet chair had done its work, she stood again. The kitchen waited with its small tasks, rinsed cup to be dried, counters to be cleared. And maybe, she thought, something sweet to bake. Hands needed work when the heart was busy mending. The kitchen's light had shifted by the time she returned from the quiet chair. Afternoon pressed in soft but certain, filling corners with a gold that was neither warm nor cold, only present. She placed her empty teacup in the sink, ran water until it hummed clear, and stood for a moment with wet hands suspended over the basin. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's even breathing and the tick of the clock on the wall. Silence didn't scare her. It had been companion before. On the small table beside the phone sat an old pine drawer she'd removed from the cabinet weeks ago. It had belonged to a sideboard once, long since retired, but she'd kept the drawer as a kind of catch-all. Today, she decided, it would be put to order. Her hands needed the work. Her mind needed the slow arrangement of small things. She carried it to the table, its weight easy but solid, and tipped its contents gently onto a folded dish towel. The sound of loose things settling a soft rain of metal and paper filled the quiet. Outspilled rubber bands dulled to dusty beige. A small brass key with no known lock, twist ties curled like sleeping snakes, scraps of ribbon from long ago packages, and a small stack of note cards bound with a thin hair elastic gone brittle. One by one, she began. Each rubber band tested between her fingers. The ones that snapped under tension she dropped into the trash with quiet finality. Those still strong she looped neatly around a saved jar lid. The key she placed aside for later consideration. Somewhere in the house it still had a purpose, and if not, it could remain a mystery a while longer. She found a birthday candle, red wax dulled with dust. It had probably belonged to the cake from his 7th birthday. The photo she'd cleaned that morning proved the color. She held it longer than needed, thumb smoothing a thin groove down its side. A memory rose. Frosting too sweet. Laughter loud enough to fill the small kitchen. His missing front tooth. She placed the candle gently in a small tin-marked celebrations, though she doubted it would ever be used. Next came old stamps. A partial sheet with birds. Corners curled, but still good. She flattened them under her palm and slid them into an envelope labeled post. Then paper clip-steeny silver soldiers, who had lost their order. She lined them in rows across the towel until they gleamed, then slipped them into a small glass jar once meant for jam. Each small action steadied her. The drawer that had been chaos became a field of tiny decisions, each one hers to make without contradiction or cruelty. The day's earlier words still floated somewhere behind her. But here her hands found gentler language. At the very bottom she found a child's drawing, folded twice. Crayon swirls of blue and green. A figure with impossible arms labeled Grandma in block letters. She unfolded it slowly, afraid it might tear. The waxy lines were faded, but still clear. She remembered that day too. Rain outside, paper on the table, small fingers gripping crayons with urgent joy. She pressed the drawing flat with her palm, then smoothed it once across her knee. It deserved better than the bottom of a drawer. She tucked it into the ledger between pages where it could lie safe. A bookmark for some future day. When all was sorted. The towel looked like a map ordered piles, straight edges, decisions made. She returned the drawer to its place. Lighter now, but not empty. Some things deserved to stay. A few ribbons, the brass key. The good rubber bands. She wiped the table clean, slow circles with the cloth. Each pass felt like a racing noise, leaving room for quiet that did not wound. Then she sat again, palms flat on the oilcloth, breathing in the scent of tea and paper and faint crayon wax. The phone remained silent. She neither feared nor wished for its ring. The ledger on the counter waited, closed, but near, the drawing tucked inside like a soft pulse. She had begun, in her small way, to choose what to keep. The light had shifted again, softer now, leaning toward late afternoon. Through the front window, the street glowed faintly. Roofs wore a thin silver where sunlight slid low and quiet. She stood at the small cabinet in the hallway, drawn there without full intention. Its top shelf held a scatter of photographs in mismatched frames, family years layered in dust and gentle neglect. Her eyes went to one picture immediately. Her grandson at 7. A party hat crooked on his head, paper crown really made from folded craft paper. The kitchen behind him had been loud that Daishe could almost hear it now, balloons bumping the ceiling. A dog barking, candles sputtering on the cake she'd baked herself. He'd grinned so wide his missing teeth showed, and his hands sticky with icing. Clutched a new baseball glove. The frame was glass-fronted but clouded at the corners where kitchen grease and years had gathered. She lifted it carefully, thumbs pressing the backing so it wouldn't fall apart, and carried it to the kitchen sink. She filled a shallow bowl with warm water and a drop of dish soap. Swirled until suds rose soft and small. Then, with an old flannel square she kept for polishing glass, she began. Small, slow circles cleared the dust first, then the cloudy residue. Her hands were deliberate but gentle. Each pass uncovered color the bright blue of his shirt, the deeper blue of the paper crown, the sharp red balloon string behind him. She caught herself smiling despite the ache. Children don't know what weight lives behind phones. They don't know how easily voices cut when hearts have softened with age. At 7, he had called her Gamma and reached sticky fingers for another slice of cake before dinner. At 7, annoyance had been a word he couldn't yet spell. When the glass cleared too bright, she rinsed the cloth, wrung it dry, and wiped the frame's edges. A small splinter of wood had worked loose at one corner. She pressed it back with her thumb until it lay flush. Then she polished once more until the boy's grin seemed to live again under her fingers. She didn't talk to the photo. That had never been her way. Instead, she regarded it silently, letting memory sort itself just as she had sorted the drawer. Behind the bright smile lay her own younger face that day. Unseen but busy tying balloons, frosting cake, managing the chaos of cousins. She remembered how heavy the phone felt when his father, her son, had once said careless things too. Years had smoothed those edges. Maybe time would do the same again. She set the frame on the counter for a moment and dried her hands. The ledger still lay near, closed but warm with its earlier entry. On impulse, she opened it and found a page not yet filled. Beneath call ceased, she wrote in small, neat script, photo cleaned, kept, just that. A record not of sorrow, but of preservation. Returning to the hallway, Shay held the frame at arm's length to find its place again. But the space it had occupied looked too low now, tucked behind other clutter. She moved a smaller picture aside and gave the birthday smile a better place, eye level where it could meet her glance each time she passed. Once rehung, she stepped back and studied the wall. It felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier with history, lighter with care. She brushed her palm once across the wallpaper seam beside the frame. A habit from years of anchoring memory to touch. Evening light caught the glass, making the boy's grin shine briefly before shadows softened it again. She let herself stand there until the shadows took full hold. The house was quiet but not empty. She could live with quiet. She had done so before and found it survivable, in the kitchen. The telephone sat where she'd left it, patient and unbothered. She looked at it once, but didn't move closer. Instead, she went back to the counter, closed the ledger gently, and slid it aside. The photograph now, in better view, felt like its own answer-less plea than reminder. Love existed before hurt, and could outlast it if given room. She turned on the kettle again. Not for tea, but for the comfort of its sound. Water began to hum, the pitch climbing softly. A small routine after a small wound. Steam gathered, and the house, though quiet, seemed to exhale with her. Thursday came the way it always did, without ceremony but with a rhythm she trusted. Morning broke pale and cool. A faint mist clung to the hedges as if the night hadn't quite finished leaving. She rose early, folded the quilt at the foot of her bed, and set about the day's small tasks, dishes stacked from yesterday, plants turned toward the window for light. Floor swept in quiet strokes that left long trails of dust across the pan before she tipped it into the bin. When the kitchen was neat and her ledger had its daily date written, no entry yet. Only the clean mark of a day begun, she dressed for town. Not fancy, but tidy. Navy cardigan buttoned to the throat. Skirt pressed, though no one would inspect it. Shoes polished enough to show care. From the peg by the door, she took her canvas shopping bag, well worn but strong, and tucked inside it the small wallet that held bus fare list, and an old photograph she kept for company. The bus stop was 3 doors down past the hedge she trimmed herself. She arrived a little early. She always did. The same driver came rumbling along at 8:30 sharp, as faithful as church bells. He opened the door with his usual greeting, "Morning, ma'am," spoken with a kind of formal cheer. She nodded, climbed the steps slowly but without struggle, and tapped her pass against the reader. 2 short beeps, then the soft slide of the doors. The ride into town lasted 15 minutes. She liked this stretch. Neat houses giving way to shop fronts with striped awnings. Then a run of open lots where stray cats claimed fence posts like sentries. She sat halfway back, hands folded over her bag, watching the small passing world. Now and then another passenger boarded, a woman with a prom, an older man in a flat cap who smelled of pipe tobacco. No one asked her to move. No one looked twice. Quiet suited her. The first stop was the post office. She'd written no letters yet, but the stamps on her list were reason enough to go. Inside, the cool smell of paper and ink. The clerk, a thin man with rolled sleeves and soft voice, recognized her but didn't press conversation. She asked for birds if they had them. He produced a sheet with wax wings perched on winter branches, wings outspread as if mid-thought. She smiled, paid with coins, and tucked the stamps safely in her wallet. Outside, she lingered on the stone bench by the low hedge. People passed, a teenager on his phone, a pair of women laughing over something private, a delivery boy balancing boxes. She sat still and unremarkable, letting the town flow by. The bench cooled her spine through the cardigan, grounding her. Groceries next. She walked slowly, not because she was frail, but because she liked seeing things clearly. Bruised peaches and glossy apples. Bags of oats lined like soldiers, shelves of preserves with crooked handwritten tags. Her list was simple: flour, oats, cinnamon, envelopes. She added butter when she saw it was on sale. At the register, the cashier, a young woman with bright nails, greeted her gently. She counted out exact change. Coins warm from her pocket, placed carefully one after another. The girl smiled and thanked her without hurry. Back at the bus stop, she waited again, groceries tucked safe in her canvas bag. The bench here faced the bakery. She could smell yeast and sugar drifting out the door. A small boy waved to her from the bakery line. She waved back, brief but real. The bus returned. The driver tipped his cap slightly as she boarded, and she returned the courtesy with a nod. On the ride home, bag resting against her knees, she thought of the photograph on the wall and the ledger on the counter. There had been no call today, no apology, but also no ache sharp enough to take her breath. Back in her kitchen, she unpacked slowly, tucking flour and oats into their jars. Cinnamon to the spice shelf. The stamps she placed on the ledger weighed enough to keep the book shut but ready. Then she sat a moment, hands folded again, listening to the house's hum. Thursday had come and gone without fanfare, but with enough small grace to count: the bus driver's greeting, the quiet purchase of stamps, a boy's wave. She reached for her pen and wrote on the ledger's fresh page, "Errands done." Waxwing stamps. World steady. She underlined steady once, light but firm, and closed the book for the night. Friday's sunlight arrived, slow and milky, stretching across the table where yesterday's stamps still lay in their crisp sheet. She turned them over once in her hands before slipping them into her wallet. Something had been tugging at her since the phone call, a need to shape words, even if they never reached their mark. Letters, she decided, could hold what voices failed to carry. She set out early, cardigan buttoned, scarf tucked close against the chill that rode the morning. The town looked washed and clean after night rain. Pavement darkened to near black, tree trunks slick with dew. The bus arrived with its usual sigh of brakes. The driver gave his small salute. She answered with her quiet nod and climbed aboard. The ride to the post office was gentle, almost meditative. Rows of tidy houses rolling past. Curtains drawn back to morning. A newspaper thudding onto a porch. Her reflection followed her in the bus window, soft and a little blurred, like memory itself. At the post office door she paused, as she always did, to let a young mother and stroller exit first. Inside, the air smelled faintly of glue and cardboard. Rows of brass mailboxes lined one wall, each with a tiny lock like a buttoned coat. Behind the counter, the same clerk from yesterday looked up and smiled, just enough warmth to be human. No expectation of talk. "Back so soon?" he asked softly. She lifted one shoulder, half a shrug, half a smile. "Need to mail something," he nodded, sliding a padded envelope to another customer while she stepped aside to one of the high-writing tables. There she laid down her things. Pen. A single pale blue card she'd finally filled that morning. It wasn't long. She had written only what she could mean without tremble. "I hope you're well. I'll give space, as asked." Love doesn't vanish with silence. She'd signed "No name it," didn't need one. He would know. Or if not, perhaps the card could be for herself. Letters sometimes were. She slid the note into its envelope, pressed the flap until it sealed, and smoothed the surface flat with her palm. The address line she left blank. Instead, she wrote in careful block letters, "For later." That was enough for now. When she approached the window again, the clerk glanced at the envelope and back at her, reading the hesitation but not intruding. "Need postage?" She shook her head. "Not today. Just stamps." She showed him the sheet of waxwings she'd bought yesterday, still unbroken. He smiled gently. "Good birds." She returned the smile, small but genuine, and slipped the letter and stamps back into her bag. "No mailing yet. Just preparation. Outside." The bench by the hedge was damp from night rain, but sun warmed enough to dry her skirt's hem if she sat. She did, cars murmured by. A young man in a delivery uniform carried boxes to the side door. An elderly couple crossed the street hand in hand. She let the hum of the place fold around her, steady and quiet. She looked at the envelope again, turning it in her hands. Someday she might address it and send it. Or maybe she would keep it tucked in the ledger. Proof that she'd answered cruelty with calm, and that she still held a thread of it, if only to herself. When the bus came, she boarded slowly, mindful of the damp sole of her shoe. The driver asked, "All set?" as he often did. "All set," she said, and meant it for more than the ride. Home smelled faintly of oats and wood polish. She set the envelope between the ledger's pages, a quiet bookmark in her life's record. Then she wrote, "Letter drafted. Held, not sent." Her handwriting remained steady. The house, too, seemed steady. A single call had torn at the morning once. Up. But today she had moved through the world bus. Bench, stamps, clerk. Small nods of kindness. Outside the window, light shifted on the wall where his photograph hung, glass now clear and waiting. She touched it once as she passed, not speaking. The silence was still there, but softer, shaped by small steps and the promise that life could hold unfinished messages without breaking. Saturday rose, quiet but clear. A washed blue sky framed by the kitchen window. She stood for a moment and let the light fall across her hands, warming the lines where time had folded skin. On the counter, her list waited, written last night in her careful block print on the back of an old envelope. Flour, oats, cinnamon, envelopes. She added butter after noticing the stub in her fridge. Below the list, she had drawn one small square. It's an empty box that would feel good to check. She dressed with the same quiet discipline as Thursday, but traded her cardigan for a heavier coat. The air had teeth this morning. The canvas shopping bag rested by the door, ready. In its side pocket, she slipped a small coin purse. Inside, she'd sorted her change the night before. Pennies polished with a tissue, nickels lined like little soldiers, quarters counted out to exact sums. There was something healing about exactness when life turned vague at the bus. "Stop." She greeted no one but nodded to a man with a paper tucked under his arm. The bus arrived with its usual sigh. The driver's hand rose in its quiet salute. She returned it and climbed aboard, steady on each step. Town on a Saturday was different, livelier, but not overwhelming. Market awnings flapped gently. Shopkeepers swept doorsteps. Church bells rang somewhere far but clear. She liked coming early before the real bustle inside the grocery. Warm air smelling of yeast and oranges wrapped her at once. She moved slowly through aisles, letting her list guide but not hurry her. Flour first, the paper bag soft and cool against her palms. Oats next, one large tin with a red paper label. Cinnamon from the tiny spice section, glass jar clinking faintly against the tin. Butter, pale and solid, wrapped in its familiar paper. She paused once by the apple bins, touched a few to test firmness, then chose 3, with skin tight and cool as polished wood. They weren't on her list, but small sweetness belonged to healing. At the register, a girl she hadn't seen before rang her up. The child, hardly older than her grandson had been when he made that crayon picture, smiled uncertainly. Eyes bright but a little shy. She said hello softly. The girl answered with the automatic cheer of someone new to work but trying to be kind. She unlatched her coin purse and began counting. 3 quarters, a dime, 2 nickels, 1 penny. The girl waited without impatience. Perhaps she had been taught to rush but forgot. Each coin landed with a soft clink. Exact, not a cent more, not a cent less. When the last penny dropped, the girl smiled wider and said, "Perfect." It was such a small word, but it landed gently. She tucked the receipt into her coat pocket and loaded her canvas bag herself, not from pride but habit. Heavy items at the bottom, apples cushioned on top. The girl offered a paper sack, but she declined politely. Grateful but self-sufficient. Outside the bakeries, scent chased her to the bus stop. Sugar, warm dough, cinnamon in the air as if approving her own purchase. She sat on the bench, bag resting against her knees, and let the winter sun find her face. People passed but didn't intrude. A boy waved once. She returned it with a small motion of her fingers. The bus arrived. She climbed aboard, and the driver, noticing her bag, asked if she'd managed everything. She nodded and said, "Enough." It was more than answer. It was true. Back home she unpacked carefully. Jars refilled, butter tucked away, apples lined like small lanterns on the counter. She smoothed her list flat and checked the tiny square at the bottom with one firm stroke of her pen. Then she opened the ledger and wrote, "Market sack change perfect said." She left the word perfect underlined just once. Light, but there. A stranger's voice had filled a quiet crack for the day. She closed the book softly and set the kettle on. Steam would rise again, and the house would smell of cinnamon soon enough. Late afternoon brought a hush that felt deliberate. The kind of quiet that comes when a house has been scrubbed of small tasks and left to breathe. Groceries were put away, counters wiped to a faint shine, floors swept until only sunlight moved across them. She stood by the fridge a moment, hand resting on its cool enamel, reading the tattered notes she'd left herself over the years, recipes in half sentences. Reminders to call so-and-so, little weather marks like storm coming or sun broke through, one scrap. Yellowed and curling at the edges, said bread almost gone. Another read Doctor Monday, 9 a.m. She peeled both away. Stale tasks didn't belong anymore. The space looked oddly blank, like a bare wall waiting for a picture. On the table lay her ledger, closed but near. She pulled a fresh slip of paper from the small notepad she kept tucked behind the salt jar and smoothed it flat with her palm. At first, she didn't know what to write. Her pen hovered, tapping once, twice against the fridge door before she set it to paper. If he calls, let the phone ring. Bake at 350. She paused, reading the sentence back to herself. The first half was not anger. It was instruction, protection. The second half, simple as breathing. Baking was the work she knew, the work that mended. Together they looked odd, but somehow honest, one for the heart, one for the hands. She tore the note free with a soft rip and reached for the heavy pear-shaped magnet she liked best. Chipped paint on one side, smooth and glossy on the other. With a push, she pinned the note dead center on the cool white door. A new rule of the house, quiet but firm, stepping back. She studied it as though it were art, Not a manifesto, just a small compass to steer the next hour, maybe the next few days. Her shoulders loosened a fraction. The kettle clicked behind her, finished heating water. She made tea without thinking, habit built into muscle and bone, and sipped while leaning against the counter. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from earlier, faintly of apples from the market. When the cup was empty, she rinsed it and set it upside down to dry. Then, because the note told her so, she reached for her mixing bowls. Baking did not ask for speeches. Baking asked for flour and sugar and steady stirring. She measured with care, not rush. Flour mounded and leveled, brown sugar pressed until it sighed loose, butter softened enough to fold easily. Cinnamon went in last, dust rising warm and sweet. The mixer hummed softly, filling silence with its small motor song. By the time the dough was scooped onto trays, the kitchen felt purposeful again. The oven door closed with a gentle thud. Heat rolled outward, perfuming the room with something comforting and familiar. She leaned on the counter, palms flat, and let herself be held up by work. While the cookies baked, she opened the ledger and found a blank space. Under yesterday's line about exact change, she wrote, "Note on fridge decided. No more, no less." The word decided felt strong enough to steady the page. When the oven timer rang a soft chime, rather than buzz, she slid the trays out and set them on the racks to cool. Golden edges, centers, still soft. The smell reminded her of years when a small boy waited at this very counter for first taste. She let memory come, but not overwhelmed. Outside, dusk leaned gently across the street, stretching shadows long. She poured herself fresh tea and stood by the window, watching lights wink on one by one in neighboring houses. She didn't know if he'd call tonight. She didn't know if silence would stretch or snap. But there was this warm cookies cooling, a house held in quiet dignity, a note on the refrigerator stating truth without cruelty. She took one cookie for herself, warm enough to break and steam. Biting into it, she felt the first easy breath of the day. Choices, she thought, can be small and still count. Night settled quietly over the small kitchen, folding itself into corners and gentle shadows. The cookies she had baked cooled on wire racks, fragrant and soft, their edges catching what little light remained. She stood for a long time looking at them, arms folded, steam rising from the last tray. The note on the refrigerator caught her eye again. 2 plain sentences, calm but unwavering. She had done what it said, let the phone stay silent, and filled the hours with work. Now there was this abundance. More cookies than she could possibly eat alone. In years past, she would have packed them into a tin lined with wax paper, waited for the doorbell and the grandson's muddy sneakers. But tonight, there would be no doorbell, no muddy sneakers, no voice calling Gamma. She took a breath and let the ache come and go, like the tide pulling once and releasing. She fetched a deep tin from the bottom cupboard, one she had kept since before he was born. Its lid bore fading red stripes and a wreath pattern. She lined it carefully with paper, folding corners neat so no crumbs would sneak under. Then she began stacking cookies, one layer, then another, still warm enough to soften the paper a little. As she worked, she found her mind wandering not to the phone call, but to other silences, her own mother's when she first left home. The long quiet after her husband's death. The wordless afternoons when her son once turned cold and distant. Each wound had taught its slow lessons. Not everything can be mended in a moment. Not every hand reaches back right away. Still, she had learned to live kindly inside her own quiet. When the tin was full, Sue pressed the lid closed until it snapped. The sound felt final, but not bitter. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked around the kitchen. No grand plan formed. Only the awareness that she had created sweetness without knowing where it would go. She returned to the ledger. Under the last entry she wrote, "Cookies baked. None spoken for." She smiled faintly at the phrasing, formal, as if reporting to some invisible office of quiet days. She set the pen down and closed the book with deliberate care. For a moment she considered walking next door, knocking on the widower's door who had left her tomatoes last week. Or perhaps the boy who played trumpet on the corner bench. But the hour had gone deep. The street hushed except for the occasional passing car. It wasn't the night for sharing. It was a night for readiness proof she could still make something and keep it safe until the right moment. She slid the tin onto the counter, just beneath the new note on the fridge. A pairing, instruction above, provision below. Then she turned out the kitchen light, leaving only the window glow from the street lamp outside to silver the room. In the living room, she sat again in her quiet chair, drawing a light blanket over her knees. She didn't cry. The cookies, the ledger, the clean counters, they had steadied her. Instead, she listened to the small, ordinary house sounds, pipes ticking faintly, refrigerators cycling low, the distant hum of tires on the main road. Before bed, she went back once more to the kitchen. She checked the tin's lid as if it were a sleeping child's blanket. Then she tapped the refrigerator door gently with her fingertips, a soft pat where the note hung. If he calls, let the phone ring. Bake at 350. Tonight she had done just that. She turned off the last light and walked to her bedroom, slippered feet whispering across the cool floor. The scent of cinnamon followed a small benediction in the dark. Upstairs, she slipped between sheets, knowing that tomorrow might bring more silence or maybe a small breach in it. Either way, there would be cookies and there would be her own steady hands. Morning arrived, bright and cold. The kind of sunlight that glances off pavement and makes you narrow your eyes but doesn't warm your shoulders. She woke with the scent of last night's cookies still lingering faintly in the kitchen. When she entered, the tin sat where she had left it, lid closed, neat against the counter edge. For a moment she touched the top with her palm. Warmth was long gone, but what it meant work, intention, still clung to the metal. She brewed tea, drank it standing by the window, and watched a young couple walk past pushing a stroller, laughing softly. It was a sound that once might have hurt, but this morning it just was. Halfway through her cup, a small decision landed without noise. The cookies should not sit idle. If not for family today, then for someone. She rinsed her cup, wrapped herself against the cold, and lifted the tin carefully into her canvas bag, cushioned by a folded towel. The bus came, as always, driver tipping his cap. She returned the gesture and climbed aboard, bag tucked safe on her lap. Town slid by. She took note of small things paint fresh on the hardware store sign. A boy kicking a ball against a brick wall. A woman at a bus shelter sipping coffee from a paper cup. Her stop was a little sooner today. The community center sat low and wide. The hand-painted sign above the entrance, bright letters slightly chipped, but hopeful. She'd passed it hundreds of times without going in. Today, her steps turned down the short walkway without hesitation. Inside smelled of paper, wood floor polish, and something cooking faintly in a distant kitchen. A woman about her age but brisker in movement manned a small service window. Behind her were boxes, clipboards, a bulletin board crowded with schedules and colored flyers. "Good morning," the woman said, eyebrows lifting but friendly. "Morning," she replied softly, setting the tin on the counter between them. "These are extra. Thought someone might like them." The woman's face warmed into a smile. "We always like extra." She lifted the lid to peek inside, inhaled, and looked genuinely pleased. "They'll be gone in an hour." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled the folded scrap of paper she'd tucked there before leaving. On it, she'd written the same phrase from her fridge notes, second line, but smoothed into kindness. "To each third, if your day ran longer than it should." She slid it across the counter. "If you want to. Write that? So no one feels greedy." The woman laughed softly. "That's good. I'll tape it up." She studied her face a moment, as if sensing something beneath the quiet, but didn't pry. Instead, she said, "Thank you. People will feel seen." She nodded, relief and something like shy gratitude passing through her chest. Without fanfare, the exchange was done. The woman tucked the tin behind the window, already calling to someone unseen to fetch plates. Outside, the sky had paled too high silver, but the air felt softer. She sat on the short brick wall, edging the walkway, and let herself rest before the bus came back. Nearby, a boy practiced skateboard flips, failing more than landing, but smiling anyway. On the ride home, she kept her hands folded and her eyes on the small world sliding past the window. Something inside had shifted again, not broken, but quietly aligned. She had taken sweetness born of ache and put it somewhere it might help. At home, she hung her coat, set down the empty bag, and opened the ledger. On the fresh page, she wrote, "Tin center left." The letters were small but certain. She looked up at the fridge note. Its instruction had been met and exceeded. She'd baked. She'd not called. She'd found a way for kindness to move outward, instead of circling hurt, for the first time since the phone went dead. She felt the house breathe a little easier with her. And though the phone stayed silent that day, its quiet no longer felt like an enemy. Late afternoon light slanted across the table, gentle and deliberate, turning the ledger's worn cover a warm brown. She had come back from the community center, cheeks still stung faintly by the cold air, but heart settled by the quiet work of giving. The kitchen welcomed her with familiar hums, refrigerator steady, kettle clicking as it cooled. A faint trace of cinnamon lingering. She set down her bag and eased into her usual chair. The ledger waited where she'd left it, closed but never put away for long. Her hands rested on its cover a moment before opening. Inside, neat rows stretched back for months each day, a small archive, bread baked. Doctor called, plant repotted, storm watched. Today's blank space was ready. She uncapped her pen, paused. Then wrote "Tin center left." Just those 3 words. But enough to hold an entire morning. The bus. The brisk woman at the window. The sign she'd offered. The skateboarding boy outside. Underneath, she added, "No return expected." She let the pen sit a moment on the paper. Watching ink dry to a dull, perfect black dot, it struck her again how this book had shifted over the years. Once it had been about transactions, money spent, things fixed, errands checked. Then about weather. Then about life's softer debris. A neighbor's visit, a letter written, grief measured in inches instead of miles. Now it was witness to something else entirely. The quiet choosing of one's days after disappointment. She turned back a few pages, scanning what came before. There was calls, seized, still stark, but no longer raw. She touched its edge with her fingertip and found it less sharp. Above it, older months when phone calls had been plentiful, notes like M. Asked about bus schedule. Heard his laugh through line, evidence of seasons. Nothing stayed one way forever. She turned forward again and wrote a small new entry. Note kept on fridge. Beside it, she drew a square and filled it in, her own subtle check mark. A private way of saying, still here, still holding ground, when she capped the pen. The house seemed to expand a little. She looked around, the afternoon light caught on clean counters, on the polished glass of the photograph she'd restored. The boy in the picture still grinned, gap-toothed, and free of the hardness of grown-up voices. She didn't flinch at it now. Instead, she let it stand as both ache and anchor. The ledger lay open, and for a moment she simply traced the paper's grain. She thought about how keeping record was its own kind of prayer. Nothing fancy, no pleading, just making sure that what happened, good or bad, had shape and was seen. A life could be held together by that kind of simple witness. Her tea had gone cool. She rose to refill the kettle. While water heated, she put away a few stray things, folded the towel that had cushioned the cookie tin, stacked the cooling racks, straightened the magnet on the fridge. Small acts of restoration. The phone stayed silent on the wall. She noticed, but felt no stab this time. Silence had become part of the day's pattern. Just another detail to log if she wished. Instead, she'll let it be. Background hum, like the fridge or the clock. When the tea was poured and steam fogged her glasses, she went back to the ledger one last time before closing it. On the bottom corner of the page, she drew a tiny bird, almost invisible. She hadn't drawn in years, but the waxwing stamps in her wallet had made her want to. She smiled faintly at the small sketch. Not pretty, but alive. She shut the book gently and slid it a little farther onto the table, where the sun would catch it until dusk. Today had not brought apologies or calls, but it had brought action, generosity, proof she could stand in her own quiet and make something of it. The kettle clicked off behind her. She sipped the tea, breathing steam, feeling the warmth settled deeper than the hurt had managed to go. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, a door closed, life continued. And here, in her kitchen, she had her record, enough to keep going, enough to build the next small day. The first true winter wind found the porch before dawn, rattling the screen door just enough to wake her. She lay still, listening. No phone. Only the weather and the house making its night sounds, beams shifting, pipes humming. She rose anyway, tugged on her cardigan, and went to the front window. Outside, the world held its pale, hushed dot. On the top step sat the tin she had left at the center days ago. Not the same one, unmistakably hers. The wreath lid winked dully under porch light. She frowned, pulse quickening, then quieted it. The tin had made its way home without an announcement. Just placed neatly, lid centered, no note dot. She opened the door slowly, careful not to let it creak. Cold air pressed against her face. She took it as one would take an unexpected hand offered in peace. The tin was light when she lifted it, not empty but not full either. She brought it inside, closed the door with a hush, and set the tin on the kitchen table. For a long time she didn't touch it. She just stood there, one palm on its cool metal. The house seemed to hold its breath. At last she eased the lid back. Inside were half a dozen cookies, hers, returned and tucked among them, folded once, a scrap torn from brown paper. No signature, just 5 words in thick, uneven ink. These helped. Thank you kindly. Her eyes blurred before she could stop them. Not weeping exactly. Just a slow, warm spill that surprised her with its softness. She sat down, tin before her, paper held lightly like a feather. The handwriting was young letters big, unsure. Maybe a child's. Maybe just someone unused to pens. She pictured the boy with the skateboard, the one who had met her gaze at the center. Or maybe not. Maybe someone else entirely. She pressed the paper flat against the table, smoothing it with the side of her hand the way she did with recipes and bills. It felt heavier than its size allowed. For all her effort not to expect anything, here was a whisper of return, small, unclaimed, but real. The ledger was close at hand. She opened it with fingers that trembled a little now. Under yesterday's entry she wrote, "Tin returned. Cookies shared." She paused, looked at the 5-word note, and then added its message verbatim in quotation marks. She didn't analyze it, didn't ask why. She simply made it part of the record. The room changed with that line added. It wasn't triumph, no grandson's voice, no apology, but something subtler. Like a door opening in a wall she hadn't expected to move. Someone out there had accepted her offering enough to send a fragment back. She rose, made tea, set the small scrap of paper beside her cup. As she sipped, she found herself breathing easier. She didn't feel cured or mended. She felt recognized, even by a stranger. Recognition had weight. When the tea cooled and the kettle dried. She folded the paper again and tucked it into the ledger between pages, a small bookmark of hope. Then she washed the tin, slow circles with the dishcloth, until the wreath pattern shone a little cleaner. She set it to dry by the sink, lid beside it like 2 halves of something still whole outside. Morning brightened and neighbors moved about. She watched through the window as a boy, maybe the skateboard one, maybe not, hurried past with his collar up. He glanced at her porch, quick and curious. She smiled before she realized it, a tiny private curve of lips. No phone call came. She didn't wait for one. The ledger had today's story now, and the tin would wait for whatever next use it might find. She turned from the window, teacup empty, ready to begin another small, quiet day with something soft returned to her hands. By midday, the kitchen smelled faintly of lemon soap and cooling bread. She had spent the morning not waiting for the phone, but tending to the ordinary, mending a loose sleeve, sweeping where crumbs had gathered, trimming dry leaves from the windowsill plants. It wasn't distraction so much as returning to her own slow repairs. The tin sat on the counter, cleaned and polished, its wreath faint, but catching light again. Beside it lay the little scrap of brown paper, now dried from yesterday's damp fingers and flattened under the weight of the ledger. When she'd first woken, She thought she might call the grandson after all, just to prove she could still reach. But the phone on the wall had looked different this morning. Less invitation, more echo. She'd chosen quiet. She poured coffee instead and opened the ledger, rereading the line from last night. Tin returned. Cookies shared. Then below it, those 5 rough words in quotation marks. These helped. Thank you kindly. She traced them with her fingertip, letting the gratitude soak through her. The phone did ring once mid-morning, a wrong number. She answered anyway, polite and brief, then hung up with care. No tremor, no sting. The call left no bruise. She realized with a slow smile that one wrong voice couldn't undo the small. Bomb left on her porch. After lunch, she slipped into her coat and walked 2 blocks to the small corner hardware shop. The bell above the door chimed thinly as she entered, boots squeaking faintly on the worn mat. She asked for picture wire and tiny brass tacks. The young man behind the counter looked up, startled to see her but quick to find what she needed. She paid in quiet bills, thanked him softly, and returned home through the crisp wind. At her kitchen table, she brought out the old. Photographed the grandson as a toddler. Gap-toothed grin and sticky hands, hair wild from wind at the park. The picture had been tucked behind other things since the call, but now she pulled it forward. The frame's back was loose. She tightened it, replaced the bent wire with the new one. Hands steadied by small work, she wiped the glass clean. Not to make herself ache, but to keep the story honest. There had been joy once, and it deserved safekeeping. She hung it again above the small desk where she wrote grocery lists. Not an altar, not forgiveness, just memory aloud, it's space. The ledger came next. She opened to a blank page and wrote, "Frame mended." Photo rehung, below it smaller. "Stories stay," she underlined once. The act wasn't grand, but it felt like stitching. Quiet, private stitching. The afternoon deepened into soft light. She baked 1 more pan of cookies, not to send anywhere yet, just to fill the house with the scent of butter and cinnamon. Habit can heal where conversation fails. She stacked them 2 cool and, without thinking, slid 3 into a small waxed bag. Not sure who they were for, only sure she wanted them ready. The phone stayed silent. This time she didn't measure hours against it. She let the house hold its hush, warm and honest. She glanced once at the note still pinned to the frig. If he calls, let the phone ring. Bake at 3. She left it there. It was still good advice, still protective. As dusk approached, she stepped to the porch with the little waxed bag and set it on the railing. The neighbor's cat, curious and bold, padded up and sniffed. She laughed softly, a sound so unfamiliar it surprised her. Not loud, but true. Inside, she returned to her chair, tea in hand, and looked toward the framed photo catching the low sun. The boy smiled out, alive in memory. She whispered, almost without noticing, "Still here?" No call came, but something within her answered anyway. Saturday morning broke with a thin veil of fog. That made the street lamps look closer than they were. She rose before the kettle whistled, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and studied the small list she'd scribbled on the counter. Flour, butter, yeast, tea. Beside it lay the wax bag she'd left on the porch last night, now empty but for a single cat hair caught in the fold. She smiled faintly, smoothed the paper, and tucked it into the trash. At the market she moved slowly, but with purpose. Bins of apples misted under hoses. Crates of carrots fanned their tops like green fireworks. She chose carefully, touching each thing as though it mattered. A loaf of rye still warm. A paper sack of pears, bruised but sweet. A wedge of cheddar wrapped in wax. She passed the flower stall, paused, then doubled back to buy a small bunch of pale yellow tulips. She wasn't sure where they'd go yet. At the checkout, the young clerk with sleeve tattoos rang her up. "Big plans?" he asked, casual. She shook her head, offered the smallest smile. "Just home things." He nodded, slipped an extra paper bag over the tulips so they wouldn't bruise. She noticed and wrote it down in her head. Kindness logged, unasked but given. Walking home, her boots clicked softly against wet pavement. The air held that clean scent only fog and yeast from morning bakeries can make. She passed the little park where benches dotted the path. One bench holder, iron sides rusting, caught her eye. She paused, tulips cradled, and let herself look at it. Not that bench, not the one from Walter's story she'd read long ago, but it carried the same patience. She almost sat, but the fog dampened the wood. Instead, she touched its arm just once and kept walking. Back home, she unpacked slowly. Each item placed with care, pears lined up in the bowl, flower tin refilled. Tulips trimmed and slipped into the only vase she owned. She set them on the kitchen table where the ledger usually lived, their color like quiet sunlight. Then she drew the ledger closer and opened to a clean page. She wrote, "Market. Tulip spot. Kindness at checkout." The act steadied her. Beneath, in smaller script, she added, "Bench touched." She smiled at herself for writing it, but kept it "Some things mattered only because you decide they do." After tea, she tied on her apron and began kneading dough. The radio murmured low from the windowsill, a station of easy old songs. She hummed without realizing it. Not the sad tune of waiting, but something softer, closer to contentment. The dough rose under her palm, springing back like small resilience while it baked. She tidied the living room, dusting, folding the throw, wiping a fingerprint off the photograph glass. She didn't hide the photo now. She let the boy's grin look over the room like weather. The phone remained silent, but she didn't hover near it. She only passed it once on her way to check the oven, brushing its cord straight so it lay smooth along the wall. The gesture was calm, almost affectionate. When the bread came out, the whole house filled with warmth. She cut one slice, thick and still steaming, and buttered it generously. Standing at the counter, she ate slowly, crumbs soft against her palm. It tasted of something more than flour. It tasted like reclaiming a day in the ledger, she added after. Bread baked. Ate first slice warm, then under it in a quiet flourish. Small joy. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted, light spilling pale but honest through the windows. She set the second loaf aside, unsure where it would go, but knowing it would go somewhere. Not everything needed a plan. The house felt different now, not full, but not empty either. A little less echo in the corners, a little more air for breathing. Outside, a few children shouted on bikes. Their sound reached her as faint, cheerful static. She let it in. She closed the ledger softly, tulips leaning in the vase like silent witnesses, and exhaled. No call, no apology. Still, the day had been lived, decorded, fed, and held by her own hands. Sunday arrived with sunlight, plain and unceremonious, spilling across her curtains and catching on the glass of the newly hung photograph. She rose, smoothed the bed, tied her cardigan close, and looked at the list she'd started last night. Only one word there: walk. It was enough. She left the house without hurry, closing the door until the latch clicked softly. Her street was waking in small ways, dog walkers. A neighbor shaking crumbs from a tablecloth. The faint sound of someone hammering. She carried no bag, only herself and the quiet steadiness that had taken root across these last days. At the small grocery, she paused outside. Not to shop, but to look across the lot at the public bench. Iron legs, slats, weathered to silver-gray gum darkened beneath. It was ordinary and overlooked, but sunlight reached it cleanly now that the fog had gone. She crossed the lot and sat, hands folded in her lap, cardigan pulled closer against a slight breeze. For a while, she just let the world pass. Cars rolled through the lot, engines gentle. A mother hurried her child along, grocery bags swinging. Two teenagers laughed too loudly at something on a phone, the sound quick and harmless. None of it required her attention. The bench felt solid beneath her, its coolness seeping through her skirt, but not unpleasant. She thought of Walter, the old veteran from the story she'd once clipped out and tucked between ledger pages long ago. She'd reread it after the call, as if to remember how silence can be weight, how presence alone can teach. He had carried his own losses and still sat among people. She felt a kinship with him now she hadn't before. She pulled the ledger from her bag. She'd brought it without deciding to, the way some bring a scarf or gloves. On the fresh page, she wrote, "Bench outside market." Sat and watched. Then, almost shyly, "World still here." She closed the book and set it beside her on the bench. A man about her age passed carrying oranges. He paused just long enough to nod. She nodded back. No words, still enough. A small boy on a scooter circled near, curious about her shoes perhaps, and she smiled at him. He grinned and sped off. She sat longer than planned, letting the sunlight shift across pavement. The world kept making its unremarkable music. Cartwheels rattling, K-Crow calling somewhere beyond the lot, tires swishing on the street. For the first time in days, she felt not just steady, but quietly joined to weather. To strangers, to whatever pulse ran under ordinary things. When she finally rose, she left the bench exactly as she'd found it, but felt she'd borrowed its patience for a while. She tucked the ledger back into her bag and walked home by a slightly longer route. Past houses with wind chimes, past a mailbox where someone had chalked a smiley face. Back in the kitchen, she set the ledger on the table and filled the kettle. As it hummed, she placed one yellow tulip petal, fallen overnight. Between the ledger's pages where she'd written about the bench, a bookmark for today, the phone on the wall stayed silent, and she didn't glance at it once. Instead, she poured tea, sat at her window, and looked at the small world outside lawns damp with dew, a mail truck nosing down the street, a neighbor lifting a toddler to wave at nothing in particular. She sipped slowly, tasting the quiet. It was not loneliness. It was presence. She had walked, sat, witnessed, and returned whole. When she closed the ledger after tea, she added one last soft line at the page's bottom. Still here? Still seeing? She shut the book gently and let the sunlight catch the tulips on the table. The day had been lived, and that was enough. By Monday afternoon, the sky hung low and pewter-colored. The kind that promised rain but never quite delivered. She had spent the morning with small, steady things laundry folded into exact squares, soup left to simmer, letters sorted into neat piles. At her elbow, the ledger stayed open, last night's words visible. Still here. Still seeing. Every so often, she glanced at the phone on the wall. Not because she expected it to ring, but because it lived there, a quiet neighbor. She had stopped measuring hours by its silence, yet its presence still asked to be acknowledged. She ran her palm lightly over the cord, untwisting a single loop, the way one might smooth a child's hair without needing to speak. Rain finally came mid-afternoon, soft and fine, tapping against the kitchen window like fingers too polite to knock. She moved her chair closer, watching droplets race each other down the pane. The house smelled of simmered broth and warm bread. Outside, cars passed with the slow hiss of tires on wet asphalt. She opened the ledger and began to write. Before she knew what the sentence would be, rain today. House kept me. She'll let the ink dry. Then added, phone quiet. Heart quiet too. Surprised her, that last line. A small truth she hadn't realized until she wrote it. When the kettle clicked, she poured tea and sat again, mug warming her hands. She thought about the grandson, his voice on that call, sharp and hurried. She could almost replay the moment without flinching now. Perhaps he'd been rushing, distracted, carrying worries she could not guess. She didn't excuse the hurt, but she didn't let it hollow her either. Thunder muttered far away, and the rain thickened for a few minutes. She imagined him somewhere under the same sky, perhaps unaware that his words still lived in this small kitchen, but also unaware that she was living well despite them. That, she decided, was not bitterness. It was steadiness. A knock startled her. She set her cup down and went to the door. Only the mail carrier, hooed, dripping. He handed her a small padded envelope. No return address she recognized. She thanked him and closed the door gently. At the table, she opened the package with care. Inside lay a thin book of poems, new but smelling faintly of print and glue. Tucked between pages, a single card for quiet afternoons. A friend from the center. No name, just those few words. She smiled, almost laughing from the small kindness of it. Not everything needed a signature to matter. She traced the book's spine, then set it beside the ledger. Under today's entry, she wrote, "Gift arrived poems. No sender named. Still felt seen." The page looked stronger with each line, like a bridge built board by board. Evening slid in gently. She lit the small lamp near her chair and opened the poetry book. Words rose off the page, unhurried, gentle as the rain outside. Some lines she read twice, savoring their quiet company. The phone stayed still on the wall. At one point between stanzas, she looked at it and felt neither hope nor ache, just a kind of calm recognition it could ring or not ring. And she would be all right either way. When night thickened and lamps glowed in neighbors' windows, she closed the book and returned to the ledger one last time. Beneath the day's notes, she added a single line, smaller than the rest, waiting replaced by living. She pressed the pen firmly, then shut the cover. Outside, the rain softened to mist. Inside, the kitchen held warmth from soup and fresh bread. She looked at the phone once more, not as a wound, but as an object in its rightful place. Then she turned off the light, carried her tea to her chair, and let the quiet evening be wholly hers. Tuesday morning arrived, washed clean by the night's rain. Pavement gleamed dark, and the tulips on the table bowed under tiny beads of water where she'd set them on the porch to drink. She woke without hurry, brewed coffee, and flipped open the ledger as she had begun to each day. Yesterday's last line stared back at her, waiting replaced by living. She touched it lightly, then turned the page to fresh paper. Blank and promising. From the window, she saw a figure pause by her front gate, young, uncertain. At first she thought mail carrier again, but this person wore no uniform. It's just a dark hoodie, zip tight, and sneakers bright against the wet walk. She waited a moment, curious but not alarmed. Then came the smallest knock, hesitant, quick. She opened the door part way. A boy 16, maybe 17, stood there, lanky and damp, hands jammed into his hoodie pocket. He looked up shyly. "Ah, hi." "Hello," she said, steady and warm. He shifted his weight. I'm from the center. The youth room. We had the cookies. Someone said you left them." She nodded. "I did." His shoulders eased a little, though he kept glancing down at the porch boards. They were good, really good. He held out something, awkwardly a folded paper bag with grease marks. "We made these yesterday. Thought maybe you'd like some back." She accepted the warm bag, felt something like sunlight under her ribs. "Thank you." He looked relieved, but still nervous. "Also, that note you wrote? About 2 each, third if your day ran longer." She smiled. "Yes." That was cool. Made some of the little kids laugh. They felt like allowed. "So, thanks." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said simply, "You're welcome. It helped me, too." He nodded, pushed his hood back, revealing a tumble of rain-damp curls. "Anyway, bye." And he was gone, sneakers splashing back down the walk before she could ask his name. She stood in the doorway a moment longer. Bag warm in her hands. Inside, she set it on the table, opened the fold. Brownies, thick and uneven, but smelling of cocoa and coffee and effort. She took one bit into the chewy center and closed her eyes briefly. Sweet, imperfect, wonderful. The ledger waited. She sat, pen in hand, and wrote slowly, "Visitor boy from center. Returned kindness." Then, after a pause, brought brownies. She smiled at the blunt beauty of the words. She added one more conversation on porch. Not alone. The phone on the wall remained silent. She realized she hadn't thought about it until now. This knock had been better than any ring. Mid-morning passed gently. She brewed tea to go with the brownies, plated a few on the small china dish usually saved for guests. Today, she decided, she counted as guest enough. The house felt changed, still quiet but not solitary. A thread now ran from her kitchen to some bright room at the community center where kids laughed and rationed. Cookies with small jokes. Her effort had traveled and found its way back. Later, she wrapped a second brownie and slipped it into wax paper. She wasn't sure yet whom it was, for a neighbor, the bus driver, perhaps the tattooed clerk. But she liked the idea of something already prepared. As the light shifted across the table, she glanced at the photograph of the laughing little boy, her grandson, long ago. She didn't flinch. She looked and let the love remain while the wound stayed quiet before closing the ledger. She wrote one last, almost whispered line. Kindness finds its own path. She underlined once. Light but sure. She left the door's chain off that afternoon, not expecting anyone but open to the possibility. The day hummed with gentle proof. You can be hurt and still reach outward. And sometimes, without asking, the world knocks softly back. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The sky rinsed pale after days of damp. She moved through the kitchen with a sense of quiet readiness. The bagged brownie she'd saved from yesterday waited by the ledger, its wax paper folded neat. She pressed the crease once more with her thumb, then slipped it into her coat pocket. It felt good to have something small and sweet to give. Her plan was ordinary. Ride the bus to town for stamps and a library. Books she'd placed on hold. But she found herself thinking about the driver, the man who'd always lifted his hand when she boarded, who had once said simply, enough, when she returned with exact change. He had been steady through all her small upheavals without knowing it. She wrapped a loaf of yesterday's bread, too, tucking it into brown paper and tying the top with kitchen twine. Not a gift, just an offering from one quiet life to another. She added a note on a torn ledger scrap. For coffee or soup, thank you for steady mornings. She didn't sign her name. It didn't seem needed. The bus came with its usual sigh, brakes whispering at the curb. She climbed aboard and found the same driver, broad-shouldered, weathered face, cap low. He nodded, took her fare. She held out the parcel shyly. This is for you, she said. He blinked, surprised, but pleased. For me? She nodded, heat rising in her cheeks. Bread, fresh, and a brownie. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his face broke into a slow grin. Well, ma'am, you just made my day. He set the parcel carefully on the dash shelf where his thermos lived. Been driving 20 years. Can't remember the last time anyone handed me breakfast. She smiled, a small lift of lips. Seems overdue. He chuckled and shifted the bus into gear. You ride with me, regular. Didn't know your name. She hesitated, then gave it. Miriam. Miriam, he repeated, respectful. I'm Carter. The bus rolled on. At the next stop, a woman with a cane boarded. Carter helped her up, gentle as ever. When he sat back down, he tapped the bread with one knuckle. Kinda day gets better from here. Miriam sat 2 rows back, hands folded over her bag. Something warm pulsed low and steady inside her. It wasn't grand, but it was connection and loot. For and real Town moved past the window. Shop fronts opening. A boy in a red coat pulling a sled over a bare sidewalk just because. She saw the world again with less ache and more noticing. At the post office, she mailed a small package of tea to a cousin. At the library, she picked up her Holden essay collection on quiet work. She lingered a while, flipping through pages, then headed back to the bus stop. Carter was still driving the return route. When she boarded, he gave a small salute with 2 fingers and a grin she'd not seen before. The bread now half gone, crust torn, thermos beside it. Best toast I've had, he said. She laughed softly, first laugh in weeks. Glad. Back home, she logged the day in her ledger. Bread to Carter. Brownie gone. Name shared. Then laughed. She underlined it. She brewed tea and placed the library book near her chair. The house felt full in a way it hadn't for a long time, not of voices or calls, but of small ties tugging outward. The center, the boy at her gate. Carter on his route. The phone was still silent on the wall. But now it looked less like absence and more like one thread among many. She had found other ways to weave connection, stitch by stitch, loaf by loaf. As dusk came, she poured a second cup of tea and read by lamplight. Rain tapping once again at the window, but no longer sounding lonely. She had chosen living, and the world, piece by piece, was choosing back. Wednesday arrived with a pale, rinsed sky and the thin scent of damp earth drifting in through the kitchen window. Miriam woke early, not restless, but full of a new, curious energy. On the table, the ledger waited. Yesterday's entry still drying where she'd written laughed. She touched the word lightly and smiled. It felt like a small green shoot breaking soil. The mail came mid-morning. A thump of envelopes and catalogs through this slot. She sorted them standing by the door, fingers quick from long habit. Bills to one side, advertisements to recycling. And then one envelope with no stamp, her own name written in hesitant ballpoint. She frowned softly, turned it over. Blank back. She sat at the table and slid a butter knife carefully under the flap. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was uneven, but young. "Hi, I'm the one who knocked. We didn't know your name, but everyone said thank you. I just wanted to say I'm glad you came to the center. The cookies made the day better. Some of us don't get things like that much. So, thanks again." Riley, she read it twice, letting the words come slow. "I'm glad you came to the center." She hadn't realized she had come anywhere. She thought she'd only dropped off a tin and left. But to someone, her small step had counted. She laid the letter flat beside her ledger, fingers tracing the name. Riley. A boy's name maybe, or a girl's. Didn't matter. What mattered was the kindness walking back to her doorstep without needing postage or permission. The ledger opened easily. Pages soft from use. She wrote "letter slid under door from Riley," then quoting the line that caught her. "I'm glad you came." She underlined "came" once. She sat a long while with the letter and a cup of tea cooling at her elbow. Memories flickered, her own childhood afternoons when a cookie or a kind word had seemed enormous. The long ache after yesterday's phone call was still there, but less sharp. Edged now by something gentler. On impulse, she reached for one of her plain note cards. She didn't plan to deliver it, just to answer the air. She wrote, "Dear Riley, you made my day with your words. Keep sharing, keep noticing, keep showing up for others. The world needs people who can say thank you." She left it unsigned, just a heart drawn small in the corner. She propped it against the sugar jar where she could see it. A quiet dialogue begun. Later, she walked to the park with a card tucked in her pocket, not to mail, just to carry. She sat on the same weathered bench, watching small scenes spool out. A father pushing a stroller, a teenager balancing on a rail, a woman with two dogs pausing to adjust their leashes. It felt good to inhabit the world instead of hiding from it. Before heading home, she tucked the card under the bench slat where a small collection of pebbles and folded notes already lived a neighborhood habit she'd seen but never joined. Today, she added her voice to the hidden chorus. Back home, she added one more line to the ledger. Left card at bench. Smaller. Answer given. Evening came with the smell of soup reheated and bread cut thick. She ate slowly, pausing often to look at Riley's notes still on the table. She didn't need to call anyone, didn't need to hear a voice explain or apologize. The world had spoken back in other, softer ways. When she turned out the kitchen light, the house no longer felt like waiting. It felt like part of a larger, quiet network. A boy named Riley. A bus driver named Carter. Unknown hands at a community center window. Small signals traveling, returning, landing. She paused once by the phone, brushed the cord smooth, and kept walking. Thursday morning began with a faint hum of street sweepers and the smell of wet pavement. Miriam sat at the table with toast and tea, ledger still open to Riley's note. She traced the underlined word "came" while butter cooled on her bread. The house felt steady, no sense of waiting, no sharp hollowness. Just her and the quiet work of the day. The phone rang. The sound startled her more than she expected. It had been long enough that the bell seemed foreign. She froze with her teacup midair, heartbeat quick. Then she set the cup down and listened through one ring. 2, 3. Her own note on the frigvif he calls. Let the phone ring flashed across her mind. But this didn't feel like him. Something in the rhythm of rings was brisk but not impatient. She rose slowly and answered. "Hello." A pause, then a woman's voice, cheerful and professional. "Good morning, this is Marla from the community center. Am I speaking with Miriam?" "Yes. I'm so glad I reached you. We wanted to say thank you for the cookies and, well, for the note. Some of the teens mentioned your kindness to our director, and we like to keep track of neighbors who lend a hand. We're starting a small card project and wondered if you might join us. You'd get notes like Riley's, but also help others send theirs." Miriam blinked, gripping the phone cord lightly. "A card project. Yes, we're calling it Voices Back. Just simple notes. Nothing demanding. We thought of you." A breath of surprise left her. "That's kind. You've already done what we hope others will. Would you consider coming by Saturday? No pressure." She looked toward the fridge at the old note, then toward Riley's paper on the table. Quiet had protected her, but maybe it could stretch now. "I think I would like that," she said softly. Marla's relief was audible. "Wonderful. We'll expect you. 10 a.m., room B." When the call ended, Miriam stood still for a long moment, receiver warm in her palm. She hung it up gently and exhaled. This call hadn't been the one she once longed for, but it was exactly the one she needed. An invitation, not an apology. A door, not a repair request. She turned to the ledger and wrote, "Phone rang. Invitation from Marla. Said yes." Then, after a pause, "Not all rings hurt." She looked at the sentence until it felt true. Her day moved forward easily after that. She swept the porch, watered the plants, wrapped a half loaf of yesterday's bread for Carter if she saw him tomorrow. She even tidied the small spare room, laughing quietly when she found an old box of crayons as once. She set them aside. Maybe they could be donated by mid-afternoon. She brewed tea and sat at her kitchen window, feeling the world tilt a fraction wider. Saturday would bring new faces, new small voices to answer. She didn't have to chase. She just had to arrive. Before supper, she added one more soft note to the ledger. Life came knocking. Then, after a breath, she crossed out knocking and wrote calling. She smiled at the quiet joke. When night fell and lamps clicked on down the block, she looked at the phone one last time. It was no longer a gatekeeper between pain and hope. Just a way for life to speak, sometimes clumsy, sometimes kind. She touched the cord lightly in passing and let it hang straight. Upstairs, the house exhaled with her. She had made it through silence to a place where sound could return without wounding. Tomorrow would come, Saturday too. She was living, and the world, in its quiet way, was living back.